The briefing room was packed. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, recording every movement, every flicker of expression. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, a silent battlefield where words would be the only weapons. Reporters, some with their laptops open, others gripping their pens tightly, were already preparing their attack lines, waiting for the moment to pounce. Then Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the podium. There was something about the way she carried herself, controlled, deliberate, with a quiet confidence, that unsettled her critics before she even spoke. She took a brief pause, scanning the room, making sure she met the gaze of the most eager questioners. She knew what they were there for. This wasn't just a press briefing, it was an ambush. They wanted to push her into a corner, to extract a soundbite they could twist into a scandal. She adjusted the microphone and smiled, but there was steel behind it. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady, measured. "I know you've all been looking forward to this briefing, so let's get right to it." A calculated pause. "But before we do, let's establish something." She leaned forward slightly, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "If the media is going to set the rules of outrage, they should at least be consistent about it." The energy shifted. A few reporters glanced at each other, sensing where this was going. Karoline continued, her tone sharp but controlled. "If a Republican stood here today and said, 'We need to fight in the streets,' you'd all be foaming at the mouth, demanding resignations, congressional investigations, maybe even arrests." She let her words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the punchline. "But when Ilhan Omar says it, suddenly it's just a passionate plea for justice?" The murmurs in the room grew louder. The reporters had come in expecting to attack her, but within the first 2 minutes she had flipped the dynamic. The so-called journalists weren't the ones asking the tough questions. Karoline was. A hand shot up, Peter from CNN, predictably. His throat cleared, his voice laced with forced skepticism. "Karoline, are you suggesting that Ilhan Omar's comments were meant to incite violence?" Karoline tilted her head slightly, as if amused by the question. "I'm not suggesting anything, Peter. I'm quoting her. Or do you deny that she said it?" Peter hesitated. The camera zoomed in, catching the flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Karoline didn't give him time to recover. She pressed forward. "Let's be clear," she continued, her voice unwavering. "When Democrats call for fighting in the streets, it's dismissed as rhetoric. But when a Republican so much as breathes the wrong way, it's a threat to democracy." Her gaze locked onto Peter's, challenging him. "So tell me, Peter, what's the rule here? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the rules only apply to one side." The silence stretched. Peter opened his mouth to respond, then shut it again. He had no answer. Another reporter, a woman from NBC, tried to jump in, hoping to shift the conversation. "Surely you're not suggesting that the president is above criticism. Ilhan Omar was simply expressing concerns about this administration's policies." Karoline turned to her, unimpressed. "So was every conservative who got labeled a domestic extremist for daring to question the Biden administration," she shot back. "Funny how that works." A few furrowed brows, a few glances exchanged. Some shuffled through their notes searching for a new angle, but they were already behind. Karoline took a deep breath, steady and controlled. "Let's play a game," she said, her voice deceptively light. "Imagine if President Trump stood here today and said, 'We need to take this fight to the streets.' What would happen?" Nobody answered. She smirked. "I'll tell you what would happen. Front-page hysteria, emergency broadcasts, calls for impeachment. The media would be in full meltdown mode." She let her gaze sweep across the room. "But Ilhan Omar says it, nothing. Just another Tuesday." More silence. The energy had shifted completely. The reporters had entered this room expecting to corner her, but now they were the ones backed into a corner. And Karoline Leavitt was just getting started. The silence that followed Karoline's last words was thick, suffocating. Reporters glanced at each other, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others furiously typing, already preparing the spin they'd put on this exchange. But none of them had an immediate answer. She had cornered them, and they knew it. Then, as expected, Peter from CNN took another swing, his voice tighter now, edged with frustration. "Karoline, don't you think context matters?" He leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. Ilhan Omar was speaking about— "Oh, I love that word, context," Karoline interrupted, her tone dripping with amusement. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Because when President Trump said, 'Peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard,' you conveniently ignored the context. In fact, you twisted it into an incitement to violence narrative." A few scattered murmurs rippled through the press corps. The tension in the room climbed another notch. Karoline placed both hands firmly on the podium. "You want to talk about context, Peter?" She let the moment hang, then continued, her voice razor-sharp. "Ilhan Omar didn't say peacefully and patriotically. She didn't even suggest peaceful resistance. She said, and I quote, 'We have to fight in the streets.'" She let the words land. Silence. Peter opened his mouth, then hesitated. The flicker of uncertainty in his eyes was caught by every camera in the room. Karoline leaned in slightly, voice steady, controlled. "So I'll ask again. Why is it different?" Nothing, not a single response. A beat passed before another journalist, a younger, eager-looking reporter from SNBC, spoke up, her voice trying for confidence. "Karoline, aren't you just cherry-picking quotes to fit your argument?" Karoline arched an eyebrow as if genuinely amused. "Cherry-picking?" She swiped at the tablet in front of her, then turned the screen toward the cameras. "Let's see, shall we?" With a tap, a video clip began playing. Ilhan Omar's own voice echoed through the speakers. "We have to fight in the streets. We have to make them fear us." Karoline let the clip play in full, watching as the faces of the press turned a shade paler. Then, with a simple flick of her finger, she tapped the screen again. This time it was a clip of President Trump. "I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol peacefully and patriotically to make your voices heard." Karoline locked eyes with the MSNBC reporter, letting the weight of the comparison settle over the room. "Tell me," she said softly but with unmistakable authority, "who exactly is inciting violence here?" The reporter shifted in her seat, clearly regretting having asked. A few seats over, a journalist from the Washington Post cleared his throat, desperate to change the subject. "Karoline, let's move on." "Oh no," Karoline cut in sharply, "we don't get to move on." She scanned the room, her eyes piercing. "Not when you all spent years demanding accountability for words far less inflammatory than Omar's. Where's your outrage now?" The silence was deafening. She exhaled through her nose, adjusting the microphone. "You see, the issue isn't rhetoric," she continued, her voice colder now. "It's who's allowed to use it. When Ilhan Omar says something reckless, she's passionate. When a Republican dares to speak firmly, suddenly it's dangerous." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Some reporters shifted uncomfortably. Others glanced at their notes, desperate for a new angle to regain control. And then, as if on cue, a chime rang from a reporter's phone. The journalist, a correspondent from Politico, glanced at the screen, then back at Karoline, their face noticeably tensing. Karoline caught the reaction immediately. "What is it?" she asked coolly. The reporter hesitated, clearly reluctant to speak, but the murmurs spreading through the room forced their hand. "Ilhan Omar," they finally said, clearing their throat. "She just responded to you." The room collectively stilled. A moment later, another reporter, eyes glued to their phone, read aloud, "Karoline Leavitt is spreading dangerous rhetoric to cover for Trump's failures. She is deliberately putting people's lives at risk." Karoline didn't react. She simply took a breath, straightened her posture, and gave a slow, knowing smile. "Well," she said, her voice rich with irony, "isn't that adorable?" She leaned back slightly, crossing her arms as her eyes flicked across the room. "So let me get this straight. Ilhan Omar calls for a literal fight in the streets, but somehow I'm the one spreading dangerous rhetoric for quoting her? A few suppressed chuckles from the back of the room. Karoline shook her head. This is exactly what I mean, she continued. They say whatever they want, and the moment you expose their hypocrisy, they play victim. She exhaled, adjusting her notes. So tell me, will you all be fact-checking Omar's lie the way you fact-check every Republican's every syllable? Or will you let it slide like you always do? Silence. Karoline smirked. Thought so. She tapped the podium twice. The battle wasn't over, not even close. A tense silence filled the briefing room. The press had spent years controlling the narrative, twisting words, selectively outraging, and now, for the first time in a long time, they were on the defensive. Karoline Leavitt had them exactly where she wanted them. The click of keyboards slowed. The flurry of notes and whispered exchanges faded. Reporters sat frozen, staring at her, as if hoping someone, anyone, could step in and regain control. But there was no escape, not this time. Karoline tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. Nothing to say? She asked, her voice smooth, almost amused. Peter from CNN shifted in his chair, then leaned forward. His face was tense, his composure barely holding. Karoline, he began carefully, aren't you concerned that your words today will only escalate tensions? Karoline arched an eyebrow. Oh, I would escalate tensions? She let the words linger, then shook her head. Peter, if simply quoting Ilhan Omar's own words is enough to escalate tensions, then maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't me. Maybe it's what she said in the first place? Peter flinched. He knew she was right. A female reporter from NBC quickly jumped in, eager to redirect the conversation. Karoline, do you acknowledge that Ilhan Omar's statement was taken out of context? Karoline chuckled softly. Ah, there it is. She tapped her finger against the podium. Whenever a Democrat says something reckless, you all rush to clarify and contextualize. But when President Trump said, peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard, you all conveniently ignored the context, twisted his words, and tried to get him thrown in prison. The tension in the room spiked. The NBC reporter's face hardened, but before she could fire back, Karoline cut through the noise with one simple statement. You don't care about context, you care about control. A ripple of unease spread through the room. The power dynamic was shifting, and they could feel it. From the back, James from the Washington Post raised his hand, his voice steady but tight. Karoline, you claim the media is unfair, but let's be honest. You're making sweeping generalizations. Aren't you playing into the same kind of rhetoric you accuse the press of using? Karoline exhaled slowly. Sweeping generalizations, she repeated as if savoring the phrase. You mean like when the media called Trump supporters semi-fascists? Like when Hillary Clinton called them a basket of deplorables? Or when Joe Biden said half the country was a threat to democracy? James hesitated. Karoline leaned in slightly, her voice dangerously calm. Tell me, James, did you push back on that rhetoric? Did you call for nuance and context when Democrats smeared millions of Americans? Nothing. Karoline smiled. Didn't think so. A new voice broke in, this time from Politico. Karoline, the White House has not responded to Omar's latest statement, and some say your response today is a distraction from real policy issues. Karoline laughed out loud. A distraction? She echoed. Let me make sure I understand. You all spent 2 years pretending Trump's words were a coded call for insurrection, but when a Democrat literally says, fight in the streets, suddenly it's not worth talking about? A few reporters glanced at each other. They could feel the narrative slipping from their grasp. Karoline exhaled, adjusting her posture. The truth is, you don't want to cover this because it forces you to confront your own double standard. She looked directly into the cameras. But don't worry. You don't have to report the truth. The American people see it for themselves. Then, as if on cue, a chime echoed through the room. Karoline's eyes flicked toward the front row. "Another Omar tweet?" she guessed. A reporter hesitated, checking their phone. "No," a pause. "It's trending." Karoline smiled. "Oh? What's the hashtag?" The reporter's lips pressed together. "Media hypocrisy." A low murmur swept through the room. The press hated when they lost control of the narrative, but now it was out of their hands. Karoline grinned. The tension in the press room was no longer just palpable. It was suffocating. The media had spent years controlling the narrative, twisting words, cherry-picking outrage. But today they were on the ropes. And Karoline Leavitt wasn't about to let up. She exhaled slowly, scanning the room with an almost amused expression. "So," she said, voice steady, "who's next?" A few reporters exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to be the next target, not after what just happened to Peter and James. But then, a younger journalist from MSNBC found his nerve. "Karoline," he began cautiously, "there are concerns that your rhetoric today could be interpreted as divisive. Do you think attacking the press is really helping unify the country?" Karoline laughed softly. "Ah, there it is," she mused. "The classic, you're being divisive defense." The young journalist hesitated. Karoline tilted her head. "Tell me, was it divisive when the media called Trump supporters semi-fascists? Was it divisive when CNN ran headline after headline calling conservatives a threat to democracy? Was it divisive when Ilhan Omar said we need to fight in the streets and you all shrugged?" Silence. Karoline leaned in slightly, her voice sharper now. "You don't care about unity. You care about control." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. The MSNBC reporter swallowed hard but refused to back down. "Well," he tried, forcing confidence into his tone, "you say the media twists words, but aren't you doing the same thing with Ilhan Omar's statement?" She clarified that she meant fight metaphorically. Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And when President Trump said fight like hell, did you give him the same benefit of the doubt?" The room froze. The MSNBC reporter stammered, caught completely off guard. That was different?" Karoline let out a slow, deliberate sigh. "Different how?" No answer. "Because it was Trump?" she pressed. "Because it didn't fit the narrative you wanted?" The young reporter's mouth opened, then closed. He had nothing. The energy in the room shifted. The media had walked into this briefing thinking they would control the conversation, that they would frame Karoline as the problem. But now they were the ones on the defensive. Just as Karoline was about to move on, another chime echoed through the room. A reporter in the front row tensed, looking down at their phone. Karoline smirked. "Let me guess. Omar just tweeted again." The reporter hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." A hush fell over the press room. Everyone knew this was about to get worse. For the media. Karoline gestured toward the podium. "Well, let's hear it." A different reporter, this one from Politico, cleared her throat and read aloud. "Karoline Leavitt is deliberately spreading lies to distract from the real issues. This is exactly the kind of rhetoric that fuels division and violence." Karoline chuckled. "Oh, that's rich," she muttered. Then, turning back to the room, she clapped her hands once. "So, let me get this straight. I'm the one fueling division and violence for quoting Ilhan Omar's own words?" The weight of that irony hit the press corps like a freight train. Karoline picked up her iPad, swiping through clips. "Here's the problem," she continued. "Every time a conservative speaks the truth, the left calls it dangerous rhetoric. But when Ilhan Omar literally calls for fighting in the streets, you all trip over yourselves to cover for her." She tapped her mic. "That's not journalism. That's activism." The room was dead silent. A veteran journalist from the Washington Post hesitated before speaking. "Karoline," he said slowly, "don't you think you're oversimplifying this issue? Political rhetoric has nuance. There's a difference between..." a figure of speech, and a real call to action. Karoline smirked. Nuance? You mean the nuance the media conveniently ignored when they spent years twisting Trump's words? The veteran journalist had no answer. Another voice, this time from CNN, cut in. Karoline, how do you respond to critics who say you're just playing the victim card? Karoline laughed out loud. Oh, that's good, she said. Let me get this straight. I'm the one playing the victim? Not Ilhan Omar, who is literally tweeting in real time accusing me of spreading lies for quoting her verbatim? The press knew they were losing this battle, and the worst part, they had walked right into it. Karoline exhaled, adjusting the microphone. Let me make something clear, she said. This briefing isn't about playing the victim. It's about exposing the double standard that every American sees but the media refuses to admit, she gestured to the cameras. And thanks to all of you, millions of people just saw it happen in real time. The press sat frozen. They had no way out. Karoline checked the time, then looked back up, a knowing smirk playing at her lips. Well, she said, her voice light but cutting. The energy in the press room was now teetering on the edge of chaos. Every attempted takedown had backfired. Every carefully laid media trap had been turned on its creator. And now, the journalists sitting before Karoline Leavitt were running out of ways to spin the story in their favor. She adjusted her stance, letting the silence settle. The reporters knew what was coming, another round of Karoline's brutal takedowns. A reporter from Politico, clearly desperate to regain control, leaned forward. Karoline, she began, your handling of this briefing has been, to some, quite confrontational. Some are saying this is just an attempt to paint yourself as a victim rather than actually addressing policy issues. Karoline tilted her head, amusement flickering across her face. Oh, that's interesting, she mused. I'm the one painting myself as a victim. She took a slow step back from the podium, folding her arms. Let's recap, she said, voice razor-sharp. I quote Ilhan Omar's own words. Suddenly I'm spreading lies. I call out the media's hypocrisy. Now I'm playing the victim. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto the reporter. But when Ilhan Omar claims that quoting her is an attack, when she runs to MSNBC to rewrite reality, the media rushes to defend her. Silence. Help me understand this, she continued, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you only see victimhood when it's politically convenient. The Politico reporter hesitated, as if choosing her next words very carefully. Karoline didn't give her the chance. This is what the press does, she said, voice unwavering. When conservatives speak, they're inciting violence. When the left says the same thing, it's just passionate rhetoric. She gestured toward the cameras. Americans watching this, they see right through it. Murmurs rippled through the room. A few reporters exchanged quick glances, shifting uncomfortably. Some were already rewriting their articles in real time, trying to salvage what little control they had left. And then, the moment that shattered the last bit of media control, a phone buzzed loudly in the front row. A reporter, eyes wide, glanced at the screen and whispered something to a colleague. Karoline caught it instantly. Let me guess, she said smoothly. Ilhan Omar is tweeting again. The reporter hesitated. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Well? A different journalist from the Washington Post sighed, then read aloud from his screen. Karoline Leavitt is deliberately misleading the public. Her dangerous rhetoric is fueling division in our country. Karoline let out a slow, deliberate chuckle. Of course. She turned back to the room, shaking her head. You see how this works? She asked. She gets caught, she gets exposed, and what does she do? Cry dangerous rhetoric and hope the press covers for her. She tapped the podium lightly. And the press? They play right along. The room was in complete freefall. Peter from CNN tried to regain control. Karoline, don't you think that dismissing these concerns is irresponsible? You're using language that could... Karoline cut him off. No, Peter, I'm using facts, and facts don't care about Ilhan Omar's feelings. The press had nowhere left to go. Karoline exhaled slowly, then delivered the final blow. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, voice calm but commanding. "By tonight, every left-leaning outlet will run the same headline. Karoline Leavitt spreads dangerous rhetoric." She looked around, challenging them. "But not one of you will acknowledge the truth, that it was Omar's words that sparked this fire in the first place." She checked the time, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Well," she said, stepping back. The tension in the press room was unbearable. Karoline Leavitt had systematically dismantled every question, every accusation, every carefully crafted media narrative designed to trap her. Now the journalists in the room were grasping at straws. A reporter from NBC News, her voice unusually hesitant, tried to regain control. "Karoline, you claim that the media is misrepresenting you, but isn't it true that your rhetoric could fuel division? Aren't you concerned that statements like yours will escalate tensions even further?" Karoline let out a slow exhale, shaking her head slightly. "There it is," she mused, "the classic move. When the media loses control of the narrative, they don't change the subject, they change the blame." She leaned forward, her gaze laser-focused on the reporter. "Let's get something straight," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "When Ilhan Omar says we have to fight in the streets, that's just passionate rhetoric." She raised an eyebrow. "But when I stand here and call out hypocrisy, suddenly I'm the one fueling division?" The reporter shifted uncomfortably. Karoline let the silence stretch. She wanted them to feel it. "Here's the truth," she continued. "You don't actually care about heated rhetoric. You care about who is saying it." A few reporters glanced at their phones, subtly checking social media. The press was losing control of the conversation. Karoline saw it and pounced. "You want to talk about division?" she pressed. "Let's talk about who's really dividing the country." She reached for her iPad on the podium, swiping quickly before turning the screen toward the cameras. "This," she said, tapping the display, "is Ilhan Omar's Twitter feed." She read the words aloud, her tone sharp. "The right-wing machine is attacking me again, but they won't silence me. We must keep fighting." Karoline locked eyes with the press. "Sounds familiar, doesn't it?" she asked, because 5 minutes ago she claimed she was speaking metaphorically. But now? Now she's playing the victim while doubling down. The murmurs in the room grew louder. They knew she was right. "And what will the media do?" Karoline continued, gesturing toward the cameras. "They'll rush to protect her. They'll call me reckless and dangerous." She folded her arms. "But not one of you will demand Ilhan Omar answer for her words?" Silent, Karoline let the moment settle before delivering the knockout punch. "This isn't about my rhetoric," she said, voice unwavering. "It's about who you allow to get away with theirs." She glanced at the press, daring them to challenge her. No one did. She checked the time, then smirked. "Well," she said, stepping back from the podium. The press room was on edge. The usual smug confidence of the reporters had been replaced with quiet uncertainty. They had come prepared to corner Karoline Leavitt, but now they were the ones being cornered. Karoline had exposed the hypocrisy, the double standards, the blatant manipulation of the media. Every attempt to trap her had backfired. Every calculated question had been flipped against them. And yet, they weren't ready to give up. James from the Washington Post leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "Karoline," he started carefully, "we've spent a lot of time discussing the rhetoric from both sides. But what do you say to Americans who feel like the Trump administration is stoking division rather than unity? Don't you think leadership should be about bringing people together, not escalating conflicts?" Karoline exhaled slowly. There it was. The final card, the last-ditch effort to pin the blame on her. She tilted her head slightly, almost amused. "Oh, I love this game," she said, folding her arms. "You spend the entire briefing twisting my words, misrepresenting the facts, and defending blatant hypocrisy. Then, when that doesn't work, you suddenly want to have a conversation about unity?" James shifted in his seat. Karoline wasn't letting him off that easy. You know what's funny? She continued, her tone sharper now. This is the same media that spent 4 years calling half the country racist, sexist, and irredeemable. The same media that labeled Trump supporters as extremists and cheered while they were banned, censored, and even fired from their jobs. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but cutting. And now, after years of pushing division, you want to talk about unity? Silence. James opened his mouth, then hesitated. Karoline didn't give him a chance. You don't want unity, she said. You want submission. A few gasps. Some reporters exchanged uneasy glances. Karoline saw it, the panic, the realization that they had lost control of the moment. She pressed forward. You want the American people to sit down, shut up, and accept whatever narrative you push, she continued. Because the second someone pushes back, calls out the lies, and refuses to play along, you call it division. She shook her head. Spare me the lecture on unity. You don't get to destroy half the country and then demand they hold hands with you afterward. A ripple of murmurs. Even the most hardened journalists in the room knew she had just destroyed their argument. Karoline took a deep breath, then delivered the final blow. You want to know why the media fears this administration? She asked, locking eyes with the cameras. It's not because of our policies. It's not because of our rhetoric. She paused, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of her words settle. It's because we're not afraid of you anymore. The room went completely silent. Not a single reporter dared to speak. Karoline checked the time, then, with a knowing smirk, she straightened her papers, stepped back from the podium, and delivered the final words that would echo far beyond that room. The silence in the room was suffocating. Karoline Leavitt's final words had landed like a hammer. The press, so used to controlling the narrative, now found themselves on the defensive, scrambling for a way out. And Karoline? She stood tall at the podium, unshaken, unmoved. She had taken every attack, every loaded question, every attempt to twist her words, and turned it back on them. Yet the press wasn't ready to surrender. James, from the Washington Post, still reeling from her last response, tried one last desperate maneuver. Karoline, he said, voice strained but controlled. If you're saying the media is manipulating narratives, then tell us. What is your message to Americans? What do you want them to believe? It was a loaded question, a trap disguised as a moment of fairness. Karoline saw right through it. She tilted her head slightly, studying James as if amused by the attempt. What do I want them to believe? She echoed. No, James, that's not how this works. She took a step back from the podium, letting her words sink in. I don't want Americans to believe anything because I tell them to, she said, her voice measured, unwavering. That's your job, remember? You don't report the news, you tell people what to think. A sharp ripple of murmurs spread through the room. James' face tightened. Karoline pressed on. I want Americans to see what's right in front of them, to think for themselves, to recognize that the so-called objective media sitting in this room doesn't hold power over them anymore. She gestured slightly toward the cameras, her expression hardening. You all can write whatever headlines you want tomorrow, she said. You can twist my words, take them out of context, call me every name in the book, but it won't matter, because the American people are watching this in real time. Another beat of silence, more shifting in seats, reporters exchanging nervous glances. They could feel it, the ground beneath them was shifting. Then suddenly a notification buzzed through the room. A reporter in the second row glanced at his phone. His eyes widened. He whispered something to the person next to him. Karoline caught it immediately. What is it? She asked, folding her arms. No answer. A second notification buzzed, then another and another. The tension in the room sharpened. Finally, James cleared his throat. He looked rattled. Ilhan Omar just responded, he said carefully. Karoline exhaled softly through her nose, amused but unsurprised. Oh, she mused, arching a brow. And what did she say this time? James hesitated. He looked down at his screen, then back at Karoline. She's calling you. Dangerous. Silence. Then a soft chuckle escaped Karoline's lips. Of course she is. Yeah. She turned slightly, picking up the iPod on the podium. With a few swipes, she found the tweet. Let's read it, shall we? She said smoothly. She cleared her throat and read aloud. Karoline Leavitt is pushing dangerous rhetoric that puts lives at risk. This administration is a direct threat to democracy, and we cannot allow them to silence dissent. Karoline let the words hang in the air. Then she laughed. It wasn't bitter or angry. It was a quiet, knowing laugh. One that sent a chill through the room. You can't make this up, she said, shaking her head. This is exactly what I was talking about. She looked up, her eyes locking onto the cameras. Ilhan Omar calls for fighting in the streets, literal words caught on video, but I'm the dangerous one? She scoffed. The media refuses to hold her accountable, but the second someone calls out the hypocrisy, suddenly we're the threat? She set the iPad down, leaning slightly toward the podium. This is why Americans don't trust you anymore, she said, her voice unwavering. A hush fell over the room. Reporters were shaken, caught in the moment. For the first time in a long time, they had nothing left to say. Karoline took a deep breath, letting the weight of it all settle. Then, with a final glance around the room, she straightened her papers, adjusted the microphone, and delivered the last words that would define the moment. Well, she said, a small, sharp smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. I think we're done here. And with that, she turned and walked off the stage. The press had lost, and they knew it.